everyone, back to our FSL Dialogues series. And today I'm really pleased to share that we have FSL member Dr. Charlotte Branchu here with us. Charlotte is a sociologist at the University of Liverpool. And Charlotte, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe your work is on the sociology of body, culture, and gender, and mainly focusing on rugby as a setting, which is the sport that you play. Charlotte, today we just wanted to talk to you because we want to share the amazing work that our FSL members do and talk about, the amazing work that's happening in these spaces. And you've been doing work in these spaces for a long time. But first of all, I want to know, how did you get interested in this area of work?
Okay, very good question. So it's, I guess, to kind of trace the background. So I did my undergrad in sociology and social policy at the University of Bath, actually, Sheree, a long time ago.
Wow.
And
how did we not know that until now?
Yeah, I don't know. You wouldn't have been there. I graduated like 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, and then I kind of went into development studies and did that for a while and worked for UNESCO in like the development sector for a bit until I kind of realized actually I am more academically minded and I want to critique stuff and I like the concepts and I like unpacking things. And so I did a master's at the Institute of Advanced Studies for Social Sciences. I'm thinking, is this the right translation?
Yes.
This is UHESS in France, in Paris, because I'm French also. And kind of thinking about a PhD project. And at the time, so I'd been playing rugby in Sweden and in France. And it just seemed, well, I was fascinated by it. I loved it. But it was also very puzzling to me for many reasons. And I think going back to that more kind of academic side of things and being in that space, there was a lot of stuff that I was intrigued about and a lot of stuff that I was angry about also. And I think it was very much a space where there was a lot of misogyny and sexism, and we were faced with a lot of, all rugby players are kind of angry, revolutionary lesbians. And when I was kind of looking at the literature about women's rugby, so this was said kind of by family members, friends, and male rugby players in a really derogatory way. And then I was looking at the literature, and then all the literature was saying, wow, rugby is full of lesbian revolutionaries. And it was said in a positive way, but it also felt really simplistic and really kind of it was trying to be really kind of positive about what that space was doing, but I felt like that was not the reality of what I was seeing. And I think from that frustration came a want to do my PhD on that. Originally, I didn't really intend to look at gender for that very purpose. So I wanted to not talk about gender, but to talk about what these women were doing in that space and the kind of, I went into my PhD wanting to talk about the embodied experience of rugby and injuries and care and pain. And so I was more on that kind of, how come do people play rugby? How come do they love it so much? And what happens when you have these really intense physical experiences and you're a woman as well? But it was kind of looking at, kind of acknowledging the concerns that women are not concerned about being women 100% of the time. Sometimes they have other things they want to do. And that included playing rugby. And so it was kind of questioning what is happening here. Why do we see some women who are feminists, but also people who really reject it, or who are sexist or homophobic? Or like, how do we acknowledge the kind of full spectrum of politics and experiences and the diversity that is within that space? So that's kind of how I came to it. It was through anger a little bit.
And so you've got a book called Tackling Stereotype.
Mm.
And so the stereotype you're concerned with, is that the one that you mentioned about rugby players being angry,
Yes.
lesbians, feminists, or were there other stereotypes that you discuss as well?
Yeah, so there's a few that I talk about in the book, and some of them are stronger in rugby, like the lesbian stereotype. That is a very kind of traditional scaremongering thing that happens to keep women out of sport, and particularly out of masculine, so-called masculine sport. So it's not unique to rugby. It happens in basketball as well, and football, and so it's a common discourse that is meant to keep people away from certain practices or certain spaces. But it's not the only one. Some of it is inherent to women's sport, which is, so there's a few stereotypes I discuss in the book, but that women's rugby is not real rugby. I think that's something you discuss in your book as well, this idea that the female version of a sport is not the real deal, really. And that, things that female athletes face in general, so questioning their athleticism or their sex or their femininity or their sexuality, essentially. There's a few stereotypes that are associated with that. The lesbian stereotype is the kind of one that sticks. I'm using Sarah Ahmed's concept here. Less and less so, thankfully. But, you talked about Ilona Maher, like she still talks about how much abuse she gets for being muscular and all these kind of things. So it's still very present in the rugby world. And it's still questions that you get on a more mundane basis as well, not just in different pieces.
Definitely. Hearing you talk, I mean, that resonates so much with me. I never played rugby, but I think as people know, I grew up in South Africa and going to university in South Africa. Those really strong stereotypes, especially about the woman who played rugby at that time, it was really kind of, and my own internalized misogyny and sexism and so on at that time, the thoughts. And then you see like the women who played netball were treated in a very different way, I think, for upholding those norms of femininity and so on. But what I really love about your work and the way that you just explained that all to us is that pushing past just that first stereotype. So yes, that's a pervasive and a really strong one, but all this other stuff that sometimes women just want to play sport. They don't want to have a feminist fight, or want to like dive into, these bigger concepts. They just want to play rugby because they enjoy rugby. And I think that's such an important message that your work brings as well.
I think it's interesting because it's kind of questioning what we want out of feminism as well, because we want it to be a collective fight, but sometimes there's accidental feminism that happens as a consequence of people just trying to do a thing. And I think, I've been to many conferences where the legend Carol Isherwood speaks, and she was one of the founders of the Women's RFU at the time, and, kind of saying, well, we didn't kind of set up a league of our own and organize the World Cup, etc., to do really feminist things. We just wanted to play. And, it's this kind of really mundane thing that people are just trying to do the thing that they want to do and do it in relative peace as well, which is quite an important thing, to not be challenged constantly. And that has a lot of positive feminist outcomes, but it's kind of like, where does it lie? Is it in the intention? Is it in the kind of process? Is it in the outcome? And I think it's just important to complexify what we mean when we look at what we're looking at. So that's kind of how I've tried to understand the diversity of tactics that I observed to try to encompass all of what was going on. Is, yes, some people will be extra heteronormative. Some people are going to be really challenging the patriarchy. There's going to be a lot of pretending to be feminine and do all these things to get away with something with a referee or something. But all of these practices, ultimately, the way I understood them, are about legitimacy and about representational work. So all of them are not trying to shift patriarchy with a big P, but they're really trying to render what these people are doing legitimate and normal, ultimately. Because gender is this kind of thing that comes to stigmatize them. Gender is about power, it's about oppression. So being seen as a woman, a women's rugby player, etc., all of these things actually kind of crystallize domination in a way. And so this work that you see people do, whether they embody this really heteronormative feminine personality or challenge it, ultimately what they're trying to do is this kind of representational work, is just to be legitimate, to say what we're doing here is totally normal, totally fine. Women can look any type of way. They can do whatever they want to do. And just to be seen as a human being, and not as the other, essentially.
That makes me acutely aware of my privilege as a man. You said you just want to play rugby, you just want to be a person. It's very easy for somebody with my privilege, I think, just to forget my gender. When I'm walking down the street, I don't think I'm a man. It's much harder for women because it's constant reminders, and everything they do is going to be women's rugby. Nobody would call it men's rugby if I start playing rugby. So it's constantly being reinforced. Your gender is being reinforced. It's hard to detach yourself from it, isn't it? And sport clearly plays a crucial role in that, doesn't it?
Yeah. And it is called the paradox of the female athlete. It's like these things can't coexist. You can't be an athlete and a woman.
Yeah.
And so to try to do that, that's why I think there's a lot of representational work. It's all about how we conceptualize these things being possible together. And we are making progress, but I think I'm kind of cautious of these optimistic narratives, because I think there are scales at which these things operate, and we see the more visible ones, but also, the local ones really matter, which is why I'm more interested in amateur sport as well than elite sport, because these connections and complexities within communities and particular spaces, I think this is where you can see things shift or not as well. But I think we can't have these broad narratives of like it's getting better or it's getting worse. I think we're always there's always a little bit of nudges in different directions, but we need to look at the different scales and spaces in which these things occur.
Yeah.
You mentioned Ilona Maher in passing there, so I just wondered if what your take on this is. Do you kind of wish Ilona Maher had been so famous when you started your work? Do you think would that have helped you? Does she kind of embody lots of the themes that you talk about in your book?
And also, if I may add, Charlotte, it strikes me that you might also want to kind of complexify the story of Ilona Maher as well. So we spoke a bit about her last week in one of our videos, but I get the feeling from your work that there's more to this story as well. So give us your thoughts.
Yeah, big questions. Do I wish a lot of things existed when I started. I started really late. I started playing rugby at 22. I wasn't aware women could play rugby before that. So I think to have exposure to people existing and doing these things is amazing in the first place. And the Olympics have a lot to do with this. Also, it doesn't mean that necessarily pathways are always there for people to do it. I think there's this idea of, you can't, if you see it, you can be it. I think that's been a big drive, and I think there is some truth to that. But I think it's also about the material and structural possibilities that you have around you, and actually being able to picture yourself doing this. So it's not just seeing it, but it's seeing yourself being able to do it, which is a slightly different take on it. But yeah, I think Ilona Maher she's obviously an icon and she's fantastic. She's not the only one in this space. There's been people like Ruby Tui that have been really influential, that have also been in the digital space, spreading really positive messages. So, we talk about it because she's so visible and she's wonderful. And I do like that she addresses the kind of critiques that she gets quite head on. And yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I think there's also many more stories that
Mm.
be out there and that need to be portrayed, because she is a feminine straight woman, and in the rugby space the more visible people are these feminine straight women, and it's great because it does a lot for the sport to say this is not threatening. You can be feminine and straight and be in the sport, and so it does a lot for rugby in general. I do appreciate that she talks a lot about pay as well and the kind of material problems that comes with. I think it's a little complicated that what I like is that there's a lot of non-rugby players also who follow her, and that allows for some visibility. I think at the time where I was writing, there was a lot of stuff on social media as well. And there was, I don't know if you remember this campaign, probably not, it was quite niche, but there was something called hashtag I am enough that came after the Irish jersey, the jersey for the national team, for the Irish national team came out. And so you had Bundy Aki and I think Conor Murray in these jerseys for the national team. And then for the women's side, Canterbury had hired models to wear the jerseys instead of
Oh,
players.
yes, I do remember this now that you say that.
And
Yes.
so there was a whole campaign where rugby players, professional rugby players and non-professional rugby players were saying, I am enough. And you had this kind of duality of them in a gown and them on a rugby pitch, and kind of saying we can be all of these things at once. So that was the debate that was going on at the time. And I think these tensions keep reproducing themselves. I think one thing that happened with Ilona Maher recently was she was interviewed about imposter syndrome, I think, and she said that she didn't have it. And I found it wonderful that she said, I don't have to feel like an imposter because I do work hard, and I do all the things that mean I deserve to be here and to be doing what I do. But I think it's in the portrayal. I was watching a game, I think it was a few weeks ago. Maybe it was her first game in
Mm.
the Premiership. And the commentators were kind of saying, oh, Ilona Maher, she's great. And what an icon of body positivity she is, et cetera, et cetera. And whilst, yes, it's just the kind of the glorification, which I appreciate, but it's like, wow, look at a woman not hating herself.
Yes, right. This is so revolutionary. Here's a woman who doesn't hate herself. Yeah.
And so it's important that she's there to say these things, but it also kind of highlights a lot of problematic stuff.
Yes.
Around attendance at games, around how we portray female athletes. She still gets a lot of abuse for being muscular, but it's just underplaying the fact that, yeah, if you're an athlete at this level, you need muscle to protect yourself.
Yeah.
You need, so yeah, I think there's a lot to say about Ilona Maher. I think there will be a lot to say as it goes on. I just kind of, I kind of wish people knew what was there also before Ilona Maher.
Yes.
A lot of people have been intervening in that space for a long time and have been doing amazing things. So not to kind of cast a shadow on what she's doing, I think her achievement is great. And I'm so thankful because we all win, from her doing this. And not just in rugby, but athletes in general. So
yeah, that point makes me think of Jean Williams, who's also one of our FSL members. She's done work on women's football and the Lionesses for many years now, and I think she has the same feeling that it's this growth post the 2022 Euros is amazing to see, and it's doing the sport so much good. But yeah, I think there is something to say for we have to also recognize the great work that was happening in that space for a very long time, and other players too, and so on. But Charlotte, I really, really appreciate the way that you just articulated that about Ilona, and also just like deepening, I think, a little bit about how we can think critically about this. So, your thoughts about, really important, the work that she's doing, the body positivity, but it's really easy, or not easy, but it's easier for a white woman who is, fairly feminine and media friendly in those ways, to do this and to be proud of her strong muscles, when, as you know, and I know you've done some work on this as well, is women like Caster Semenya, who are absolutely castigated for exactly the same thing, speaking up quite proudly about her body and her strength and what it can do, and she actually ends up being pushed out of the sport. So I'm really pleased that you brought that up, because I think that's a really important part for us to talk about as well. And speaking about bodies, I was looking at your papers that you've published, and I haven't read it, I will admit, but maybe you can tell us a bit about it. There was one that you published in 2023, and it talks about this situatedness and meaning about rugby, but it's got the word bruises in the title. Legitimacy and respectability on the skin, bruises, women's rugby, and situational meaning. Tell us a bit about that, because I'm fascinated. I want to know why bruises matter so much.
Oh, yeah, you can't work on rugby and not talk about bruises, essentially, because it's just part of the physicality of playing. And you can't play a game, come out unscathed, essentially. So you will have bruises inevitably. And usually after game day, people send on the chat kind of pictures of their bruises, and it's kind of the contest of who has the biggest and meanest bruises. So within the rugby world, it's something that is really valued because it highlights all the things that are valued about the game. So this sense of abnegation, putting your body on the line, really going for it. And so having bruises is this kind of badge of honor within the rugby world, very different to boxing, where it means you've been hit by someone. This is a good thing. But the thing is, obviously, I happen to look at rugby, but I'm interested in how these things intersect with people's lives in general. It's not just what happens within the sport, but it's how things kind of transcend different social spheres as well. And so for men having bruises and being a rugby player, it's definitely valued no matter what. For women, it's going to be socially read and interpreted in very different ways outside of that rugby world. So there's different hierarchies of value that come into play here. And I kind of try to highlight the situationality of the spaces that these women enter and how they have to negotiate these body marks, because it's not like an injury. It's something that is visible, that is on the skin. And it's this contradiction of something that you acquire by being strong and brave. But then when you're on the bus or at work, that power gets completely taken away from you because people read and interpret things and impose a narrative on you through that body mark on your skin that totally disempowers you. And usually, so this is discussed among the rugby world, but usually if you're a woman, the interpretation is that you have been abused. You're a victim of domestic violence. So it's an ultimate sign of victimhood and weakness in many ways, which it's good that people have awareness of these things. And sometimes that can, raise red flags, but it's the huge contradiction in how it was acquired and how it's interpreted in one world and how it's interpreted in another world. And so I kind of analyze all the tactics that people put into play to try to have control over that narrative. Again, it's this idea of trying to legitimize what their body is and what things mean, but it's trying to avoid that stigma that gets imposed on them through looks and interactions and things where they have no say.
And it really is a contradiction, isn't it? Because yes, people will make assumptions about victimhood and fragility of the female body, but actually it's quite the opposite. It's because people have sort of dared to transgress some of the gender norms and put their body on the line, and it's the very opposite of fragility. It's showing how tough they are, which having spoken to you about this over the last 20 minutes, I'm getting a sense of the kind of thinker that you are. You know, some thinkers, I think, like to go for sort of generalizations and you know, looking for a nice simple message that comes out of it. But others are kind of more interested in the nuance and the complexity and making lots of distinctions. And you're really coming across as someone who wants to do that. You're against any kind of oversimplification of the messages here.
Yeah, and my next point was going to be, and it depends on who's got it. And that tells you a lot about privilege and positionality as well, because according to who has it, how they present in terms of gender, their kind of body type, their kind of class and job that they have more or less power and control over these things as well. So by trying to reestablish respectability, there's a lot of different tactics that are not just about, you know, reestablishing this was acquired through rugby or something like this, but there's also dynamics where you want to show that off. Some people do show it off because it's a marker of distinction. Like, I'm not like all the other girls. I can be mean and brave and strong. So it's like there's a lot of, we have to acknowledge the complexity of the situations, but also of the actors within these situations, what that means about their own social position and how they then take certain positions. And so, yeah, no, I'm all about complexities. It is important to have kind of these broader understandings, but I think I'm very, because I'm in this world, I guess, as well, I'm very aware of all the complexities and diversity within that. And I think that's a beautiful thing about rugby. It celebrates diversity, it necessitates diversity. And I think by kind of trying to smooth over that and, you know, think everyone is the same within that space, you kind of lose also the power and the good thing about the sport as well.
Mm. Oh my gosh, you know, hearing you talk about bruises makes me think about something we wrote about in our book, which is pole dancing, which to many people would be the complete opposite, you know, to rugby. But really, people who do pole also end up with many bruises all over their body, often in intimate places. And it's that same negotiation, including with that kind of stigma of like what a woman is supposed to do and not supposed to do, and how that's read in different places and so on. So that's so fascinating to hear you talk about that. And I can just see the parallels in many different ways. Charlotte, what are you working on at the moment that you're excited about?
So apart from teaching,
Yes.
which yeah, so at the moment I'm actually at a really kind of brainstorming stage, to be honest. So there is, like you say, I work on bodies and gender, and I'm very interested in the sociology of value and valuation. But I also do that in education. So there's a project here that I've got to finish. There's a few articles that I really want to write about and I feel really passionate about. So there is a lot of stuff about injury and care that I want to write about, and I've been writing about for a long time without finishing it, because it's probably 3 articles in one that I'm trying to put together. So that's kind of where my thinking is at the moment. So I'm writing about injuries, and I'm writing about a concept that I mentioned in the book called pragmatic politics, which is this idea of kind of choosing your battles and creating space for yourself within the kind of limited scope that you can have. So to kind of fully flesh out that concept. But I am also kind of writing some bids at the moment. So trying to flesh out some of these things, but which is why I'm at this really kind of brainstorming stage of having multiple ideas and trying to identify what it is that I really care about and what it is that can be a really good kind of platform for enabling good research and taking people with me where so
That is such an exciting stage to be at. I feel like it's really nice when you get to a point where you're like, okay, what is this next kind of phase going to be? And I love this idea of the pragmatic stuff, because that seems so relevant in our world today, where, you know, the world really feels like a terrifying place for many of us right now. And what can we do within our own limited scopes at this point in time? You know, what are those battles that we can choose and how do we look after ourselves in these spaces? And I think that's why all of us think sport is really important for this, because it can be so easy. I think there's this narrative out there that sport is just, removed from politics and from everything, but we all see and know how it actually shapes politics in our world and all of that.
So much. And I think it's also kind of trying to counter the narrative that people are not aware of the domination and oppression that they're kind of in, and I argue that people know exactly what's happening. They're very aware of their oppression. It's just they can't always do something about it in meaningful ways. They don't always have outlets. They don't always have unions or things where they can kind of invest their politics in. So sometimes they have to do these much smaller ways of doing politics. It's much more interactional, much more representational. It's not perhaps what we would like, we wouldn't want a revolution, but it's kind of acknowledging all these things happen within particular circumstances that are limited and structuring of what we can do.
So Charlotte, we usually finish these dialogues by asking everybody the same question, which is about the Feminist Sport Lab itself. So I think you were one of the very first members. You were certainly one of the first people we approached. So you've been a member just about as long as anyone now. So just wonder if you've got any thoughts on what you enjoy about Feminist Sport Lab, what's important about it for you. What excites you about FSL?
Okay, a lot of things excite me about FSL. I can't express, I've told you this before, I think, but I can't express how happy I was to have found you, because I think we operate in our own things, and we go to conferences, we do these things, and you don't always see your people in these spaces. And I think seeing Sheree's work, obviously, I knew, and you were writing this book, and I was like, wow, this is the book I want to write. And so to have found you was, just really thrilling for me. And I think to have your collective approach, I think there's so many people that are doing exciting things. It's a collective endeavor. And I think to have a group of people where, de facto, we kind of align on so many things and so many ideas is great. And, to have that as a resource as well, if I think, I'm not sure about this kind of physiological aspect of this and that, I know there will be someone in the group who will know this. So I love the ethos of it. I find it really exciting where it's going. I think it has so much potential because it is so important. This is something that I've cared about since I was a child, essentially, playing around with boys in the courtyard.
Join the club. Yeah, we all feel that way.
But
I'm so glad to hear that. It's so lovely. And I think that's what we all feel is, I like the way you said, like, you found your people, and I think we all feel that way. And it's really nice just to have this support, because as you say, you don't always know, what people's values are. And FSL very much is values first, and then we do the work, in the world.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Charlotte.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Charlotte. It's been amazing talking to you. And I'm just kind of sad that it was so short, because we need to talk more, definitely. I could talk to you forever. But I'm sure there'll be more stuff coming out from us as a collective as well, as we continue our work together. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to everyone for watching today. And we'll see you again soon.